My 12-year-old grandson looked up from his tablet during our regular Saturday afternoon together, completely unprompted, and asked me a question that I've been unable to stop thinking about since. "Grandpa, why does Dad keep asking about your life insurance? He was on the phone with someone last week talking about it, and I heard him say your name a bunch of times."
I sat there in my recliner, a cup of coffee going cold on the side table beside me, trying to process what my grandson had just told me. I hadn't discussed my life insurance with my son, Curtis, in years, not since the policy's initial setup shortly after his mother, my wife Beatrice, passed away 6 years ago. I want to tell you exactly what I discovered over the following month, because my son had been quietly researching and inquiring about my life insurance policy for reasons that, once I fully understood them, revealed a level of calculated planning around my eventual death that I never imagined my own child capable of.
My name is Gordon. I'm 69 years old. And this is the story of the innocent question my 12-year-old grandson asked me on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, and the unsettling discovery it led me to about my own son's plans for a policy meant to protect my family, not to be exploited by one specific member of it.
If you've ever had a child inadvertently reveal something troubling about an adult in their life, simply by mentioning something they overheard without understanding its full significance, stay with me until the end, because this story goes somewhere I think you'll find genuinely satisfying. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from.
Let me take you back to where this actually started, because understanding my relationship with Curtis and the full context of that life insurance policy matters considerably to everything that followed. My wife Beatrice passed 6 years ago from complications related to type 2 diabetes that had progressed considerably in her final years, despite our best efforts to manage it. We'd been married 41 years, and her death left a specific kind of silence in my life that I've never fully adjusted to, even now, 6 years later.
I remember, specifically, the last good year we had together before her health began its more serious decline. A year that included a genuinely wonderful trip to visit Danielle and her family. Beatrice still mobile enough then to walk the local trails near Danielle's house, still sharp and funny in exactly the way she'd been throughout our entire marriage. I hold on to memories like that one deliberately now, understanding that grief, over enough years, gradually allows the better memories to surface more easily than the difficult final months, though I won't pretend that transition happened
quickly or without considerable difficulty along the way. Shortly after her passing, following the advice of a financial planner I'd consulted about updating my own affairs, I purchased a modest but meaningful whole life insurance policy, valued at $300,000, naming my 2 children, Curtis and his sister, Danielle, as equal beneficiaries.
I want to explain why I made this decision at the time, because it matters to understanding my own thinking during that period. Beatrice and I had built a comfortable but not extravagant life together. I'd spent 33 years working as a postal service supervisor, a career that provided a stable pension, but not the kind of significant accumulated wealth that would leave a substantial inheritance for my children beyond the modest value of my paid-off house and retirement savings. The life insurance policy felt at the time like a meaningful way to ensure both of my children would
receive some genuine financial benefit from my eventual passing, regardless of how my other assets might be structured or divided.
I remember the specific conversation with that financial planner, a careful, patient man named Roland Castellan, who'd been recommended to me by a former colleague. Sitting in his office about 2 months after Beatrice's funeral, still deeply raw with grief, trying to make responsible decisions about my remaining years, despite feeling, most days during that period, barely capable of managing ordinary daily tasks. Roland walked me through several options, And I remember choosing the whole life policy specifically because of its guaranteed nature, its predictability, qualities that felt particularly important to me during a period when so much of my life had suddenly become unpredictable and uncertain in ways I'd never previously experienced.
I have 2 children. My daughter, Danielle, lives about 3 hours away, works as a physical therapist, and while our relationship has always been warm, distance naturally limits how frequently we see each other, beyond holidays and occasional planned visits. My son Curtis lives about 15 minutes from me, and in the years following Beatrice's death, he became, along with his son, my grandson Tyler, my primary day-to-day family connection.
I want to be fair to Curtis in describing our relationship over these past 6 years, because fairness matters in a story like this one. Curtis has been, in many genuine ways, a good son during this period. He's helped me with various home maintenance projects I've found increasingly difficult to manage alone. He brings Tyler over regularly for our Saturday afternoons together, a tradition that began shortly after Beatrice's death, and that has become one of the genuine joys of my remaining years, watching my grandson grow, sharing interests, building a relationship that feels, in its own way,
like a continuation of Beatrice and I always hoped our family would eventually include.
But I want to describe something about Curtis's broader life circumstances that I think matters considerably to understanding what eventually happened. Curtis works in commercial real estate sales, a career that involves genuinely significant income variability. Excellent years followed sometimes by considerably more difficult stretches when the broader market slows or specific deals fall through unexpectedly. About 18 months before Tyler's question, Curtis had gone through a particularly difficult professional stretch, losing 2 significant commission-based deals in relatively quick succession due to circumstances largely outside his control. Financing arrangements that fell apart at the buyer's end rather than through any fault of Curtis's own efforts.
I remember Curtis explaining the first of those failed deals to me over dinner about 2 years ago. Genuine disappointment evident in his voice as he described months of careful negotiation and relationship building that had ultimately amounted to nothing when the buyer's financing fell through at the final stage. A common enough occurrence in commercial real estate, he explained, but no less painful for its familiarity. I remember feeling genuine sympathy for him during that conversation, understanding from my own 33 years in a considerably more stable postal service career how
difficult it must be to build an entire livelihood around income that could evaporate so suddenly through circumstances entirely outside one's own control or preparation.
I helped Curtis financially during this difficult stretch, more than once. Amounts that never felt excessive at the time, but that, looking back, probably totaled somewhere around $15,000 across several separate instances over about a year. I never tracked these amounts formally or discussed them as any kind of loan requiring repayment, simply helping my son through a genuinely difficult professional period the way any father reasonably would. I've come to think of that particular Saturday as something of a dividing line in my recent life. A genuinely ordinary afternoon that, in hindsight, marked the beginning of one of the more difficult and ultimately clarifying months our family has experienced since Beatrice's passing. I want to describe the specific Saturday when Tyler asked his question, because the ordinariness of that afternoon matters to understanding how genuinely unexpected his comment was. We'd spent the early afternoon working on a model airplane kit together, a hobby Tyler had recently developed genuine enthusiasm for, and we'd settled into my living room afterward, Tyler on his tablet, me reading, the comfortable, unremarkable quiet of a typical grandfather-grandson afternoon together. I want to describe that model airplane project in a bit more detail, because it had become something genuinely meaningful in our relationship over the preceding several months. a hobby Tyler and I had started together after he'd expressed curiosity about a similar kit I'd built as a boy myself. The same kind of balsa wood and tissue paper construction that had occupied countless hours of my own childhood decades earlier. Watching Tyler develop the same careful patience the hobby requires, the same satisfaction in slowly assembling something delicate and precise, gave me a specific joy I hadn't fully anticipated when we first started. A genuine sense of continuity between generations that felt particularly meaningful, given how much of my own childhood memories had begun to feel distant and difficult to fully access as I've gotten older.
"Grandpa, why does Dad keep asking about your life insurance?" Tyler asked, not looking up from his tablet, his tone carrying the particular casual curiosity children sometimes have about adult conversations they've partially overheard without fully understanding their significance. "He was on the phone with someone last week talking about it, and I heard him say your name a bunch of times."
I asked Tyler, keeping my own tone carefully casual so as not to alarm him or make him feel he'd said something he shouldn't have, whether he remembered any other specific details from what he'd overheard. He thought about it for a moment, still mostly focused on his tablet, and mentioned that his father had used a word he didn't recognize, something like viatical, which he'd found strange enough to remember, along with a phrase about accelerated benefits that he'd also found confusing. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, sitting in my recliner, trying to maintain a calm exterior for Tyler's benefit, while my mind raced through the implications of what he'd just told me. I didn't recognize the specific term he was attempting to describe, but something about the combination of life insurance, accelerated benefits, and a term that sounded like it might be viatical struck me as significant enough to require immediate, careful investigation once Tyler had gone home for the evening.
I remember specifically the effort it took to keep my voice light and unconcerned for the remainder of that afternoon, continuing to ask Tyler about his tablet game, about school, about an upcoming class field trip he was excited about, while some considerably more anxious part of my mind kept circling back to what he'd just told me. I've always tried to shield Tyler from adult concerns that aren't his to carry, and I was determined that particular afternoon not to let whatever unease I was feeling become his burden as well, at least not until I understood more clearly what, if anything, I was actually dealing with.
I want to tell you what I discovered that same evening, because a relatively brief amount of internet research revealed something that considerably deepened my initial concern. A viatical settlement, I learned, refers to a specific financial arrangement where a life insurance policyholder sells their policy to a third party, typically for a lump sum considerably less than the eventual death benefit, in exchange for immediate access to a portion of that value while the policyholder is still living. This arrangement is typically marketed toward individuals with terminal illnesses seeking to. Now, I don't have any terminal diagnosis. I want to be entirely clear about that. I've had ordinary, unremarkable health concerns typical for a man my age. Some minor cardiac monitoring, standard blood pressure medication, nothing whatsoever suggesting any kind of terminal prognosis that would make a viatical settlement a relevant or appropriate consideration for my own actual policy. I barely slept that night, lying awake turning over the specific words Tyler had used, trying to determine whether I was overreacting to what might genuinely be an innocent misunderstanding, or whether the specific combination of terms he'd mentioned really did suggest something as troubling as my initial instinct had suggested. I finally fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning, still without any clear resolution to that internal debate, and I woke up the following morning determined to at least gather enough factual information to know whether my concern was actually warranted before allowing myself to spiral further into anxious speculation. I want to describe what I did the following morning because I approached the investigation carefully rather than immediately confronting Curtis based on a 12-year-old's partial, second-hand overhearing of an adult conversation.
I called my insurance company directly, a company I'd maintained coverage with for over 6 years without any prior issue or inquiry, and I asked, as clearly as I could manage while trying to remain calm, whether there had been any recent inquiries or activity on my specific policy.
The representative I spoke with, after appropriate identity verification, confirmed something that considerably escalated my concern. There had indeed been a recent inquiry regarding my policy, made approximately 3 weeks earlier, requesting information about the process for policy transfer and accelerated benefit options, though the representative explained that no formal action had actually been taken on the account, as any such transfer would require my own direct authorization and signature, protections built into the policy specifically to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized third-party manipulation I was apparently now investigating. I asked, as directly as I could manage, whether the company could identify who had made this inquiry. The representative explained that due to privacy protocols, they couldn't share specific caller identification details without a formal investigation being opened. But she did confirm that the inquiry had come through a phone call rather than through my own online access, suggesting whoever made the call had, at minimum, my policy number and enough personal information to pass basic identity verification questions, information that I realized with growing unease Curtis would have. Had access to, given his general awareness of my financial affairs as my son, and occasional emergency contact for various accounts.
I considered, briefly, simply confronting Curtis directly and immediately once I'd confirmed the insurance company's information, but something held me back from that immediate impulse, a sense that I needed additional context before I could approach the conversation productively, rather than purely from a place of hurt and suspicion. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my daughter, Danielle, before confronting Curtis directly, because her perspective, coming from someone with less day-to-day involvement in my life but genuine care about my well-being, helped me approach the
situation with more clarity than I might have managed entirely on my own.
I called Danielle that same day, explaining everything Tyler had mentioned and everything the insurance company had subsequently confirmed. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said something that, in hindsight, provided an important piece of context I hadn't previously considered. "Dad, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but Curtis mentioned to me a few weeks ago, kind of in passing, that his real estate situation had gotten considerably worse than I think he's told you directly. He said something about potentially losing his license temporarily due to some kind of compliance issue with a recent deal. And I got the sense he was genuinely panicking about how he was going to cover his mortgage and Tyler's private school tuition if that actually happened. This additional context, while not excusing whatever Curtis might actually be planning, helped me understand the specific financial desperation that might be motivating whatever he was researching regarding my policy. I asked Danielle why Curtis hadn't shared more of this directly with me himself, and she was quiet for a moment before answering. "I think he's embarrassed, Dad. You worked the same steady job for over 3 decades, and I think Curtis has always felt a little bit like he was supposed to build something even more successful than that, given all the opportunities he's had that you didn't necessarily have at his age. I think admitting to you, specifically, that his career was falling apart felt like admitting some kind of failure he wasn't ready to face directly, especially with you." I found this observation genuinely useful in understanding not just what Curtis might be doing regarding the insurance policy, but the broader emotional context of pride and shame that had apparently been shaping his choices during this difficult period. I spent the 2 days between my conversation with Danielle and the actual confrontation with Curtis, carefully considering exactly how I wanted to approach it, wanting to communicate the genuine seriousness of what I discovered without immediately closing off the possibility of a productive, honest conversation about whatever underlying crisis had actually motivated his research. I want to describe the confrontation itself,
because I approached it, once I felt I had sufficient information, directly but calmly, wanting to understand Curtis's actual intentions rather than simply accusing him.
Based on incomplete information, I invited Curtis over for what I framed as an ordinary evening visit. And once Tyler had settled in front of the television in another room, I told Curtis, calmly and directly, exactly what Tyler had mentioned, and exactly what the insurance company had subsequently confirmed about the recent inquiry.
I watched my son's face move through several rapid stages as I spoke. Initial surprise, presumably at learning Tyler had overheard and repeated the phone conversation, followed by something that looked like genuine, uncomfortable recognition that he'd been discovered before he'd fully worked out whatever plan he'd apparently been developing.
"Dad, I can explain," he said, his voice tight with what sounded like genuine distress. "I wasn't trying to do anything behind your back exactly. I've just been in an incredibly difficult financial position, and I read online about viatical settlements as a general concept, and I got curious, hypothetically, about whether something similar might apply to a policy like yours, even though I know you're not actually terminally ill. I think I was just desperately looking for any possible option, however unrealistic, and I made that call without really thinking through how it would look, or how invasive it actually was to inquire about your policy without ever discussing it with you first." I want to be honest about what I felt hearing this explanation. Part of me understood, intellectually, the genuine desperation that might lead someone to research increasingly unrealistic financial options during a period of significant professional and financial crisis. But another part of me, the part that had spent the previous 24 hours seriously wondering whether my own son might be considering some kind of scheme involving my life insurance policy while I was still very much alive and healthy, couldn't fully reconcile his explanation with the specific, deliberate action of actually calling my insurance company and inquiring about transfer processes for a policy that wasn't his to transfer.
"Curtis," I said, "even accepting everything you're telling me at face value, I need you to understand something important. You called my insurance company, using information about my personal policy, inquiring about transferring or accelerating benefits on a life insurance policy that exists specifically to benefit you and your sister after my eventual natural death. Regardless of how desperate you were feeling, that's not a hypothetical exploration of general financial concepts. That's taking concrete action regarding an asset that isn't yours, without ever once discussing it with me."
I want to tell you about the fuller conversation that emerged over the following hour, because it revealed a considerably more complete picture of Curtis's actual financial situation and thinking than the initial, somewhat defensive explanation he'd offered.
Curtis's real estate compliance issue, it turned out, was more serious than what he'd shared even with Danielle. He was facing a formal review by the State Real Estate Commission related to some documentation irregularities on a recent commercial deal. Irregularities that, while apparently not intentionally fraudulent on his part, stemmed from relying on inaccurate information provided by a client, but that nonetheless put his license and his entire livelihood at genuine risk of suspension pending the review's outcome. I watched Curtis's composure crack slightly as he described the specific
mechanics of the compliance issue. A client who had provided falsified income documentation for a commercial loan application. Documentation Curtis had passed along in good faith without independently verifying. A mistake that, while understandable given the ordinary pace and trust involved in his profession, had nonetheless left him exposed to serious professional consequences through circumstances he genuinely hadn't fully controlled or anticipated. Combined with his already reduced income from the earlier failed deals, Curtis was facing a genuinely precarious financial situation, one that, he admitted, had led him into increasingly desperate research about any possible source of emergency funds.
including, apparently, an ill-considered exploration of whether my own life insurance policy might somehow be leveraged before my actual death, despite understanding, even as he made that call, that such an arrangement would require my active, informed participation, rather than something he could simply arrange independently.
That first hour of conversation left both Curtis and me emotionally exhausted, sitting in near silence for several minutes once the initial explanations and defenses had been exchanged. Each of us, I think, trying to figure out what an honest path forward from this moment might actually look like. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because addressing both the immediate breach of trust and the underlying financial crisis required considerably more than a single difficult conversation.
I formalized, with the help of an attorney, a clear, notarized notation on my insurance policy, specifically restricting any future inquiries or account access to my own direct, verified authorization, closing whatever gap had allowed Curtis's initial call to proceed as far as it had, even though the actual transfer itself would have ultimately required my signature regardless. The attorney who helped me with this process, a careful woman named Miriam Fontaine, who came recommended through Roland's office, explained that this kind of restriction, while relatively uncommon for policyholders to request proactively, has become increasingly available as insurance companies have recognized growing concerns about exactly the kind of situation I'd experienced: adult children or other family members inquiring about policies belonging to aging parents, sometimes with entirely innocent intentions, but sometimes, as Miriam gently noted from her own professional experience, with considerably less innocent motivations that policyholders themselves often remain unaware of until circumstances force the issue into the open, much as mine had. I also had a longer, more difficult conversation with Curtis about the genuine severity of his financial and professional crisis, one that revealed he'd been managing this significant stress largely alone, without fully confiding in either Danielle or me about the actual scope of what he was facing, a pattern of isolated, private struggle that had apparently contributed directly to the increasingly desperate, poorly considered research he'd eventually conducted regarding my policy. I remember asking Curtis directly, during this longer conversation, why he'd chosen to carry this burden so entirely alone, rather than reaching out to either Danielle or me sooner, before the pressure had built to the point of leading him towards such a troubling decision regarding my insurance policy. He was quiet for a long moment before answering, his eyes fixed somewhere on the kitchen table rather than meeting mine directly. I think I kept telling myself I could fix it before anyone needed to know how bad things had actually gotten. Every week, I thought, just one more good deal, and everything evens out, and I just kept pushing that timeline further and further out, until I was making decisions I never would have considered if I'd let either of you in on how scared I actually was.
I want to describe the specific way I chose to respond to the underlying crisis, because I think it matters to understanding how this situation ultimately resolved. Rather than simply cutting off financial support, given the breach of trust regarding my insurance policy, I decided, after careful consideration and a longer conversation with both Curtis and Danielle together, to help Curtis more substantially and fully with his actual, legitimate financial crisis, not through any manipulation of my life insurance policy, but through a modest, clearly documented loan from my regular savings, structured with an actual repayment plan and formal terms, along with connecting him with an attorney I knew through my Postal Service pension advisory group, who specialized in real estate licensing compliance issues, ultimately helping him navigate the commission review successfully over the following several months.
I want to be clear about why I made this choice, because I think it reflects something important about how I've come to understand the entire situation. Curtis's underlying desperation was genuine,
even though the specific action he'd taken regarding my policy represented a serious, troubling breach of trust that I couldn't simply overlook or excuse. Addressing only the breach of trust without also addressing the genuine crisis that had motivated it would have left the underlying vulnerability unresolved, potentially setting the stage for some future, similarly troubling decision born from
continued, unaddressed desperation. I discussed this reasoning at length with Danielle before finalizing my decision, wanting her genuine input, given that she was, after all, an equal beneficiary of the very policy Curtis had inquired about, and any decision I made regarding how to handle the situation would inevitably affect her interests as well as mine. She agreed with my approach, though she suggested, wisely I think, that the formal loan structure and repayment schedule should be documented clearly enough that it wouldn't create any future ambiguity or resentment between the two of them regarding fairness, a suggestion I incorporated directly into the final arrangement Curtis and I ultimately established together. I'd thought carefully, in the weeks leading up to this conversation, about exactly how much detail was appropriate to share with a 12-year-old, wanting to honor his genuine role in bringing this situation to light, without burdening him with adult financial and family complexities he wasn't developmentally prepared to fully process. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Tyler about a month after his original question, because I think it matters to understanding how I approached explaining this entire situation to a 12-year-old who had, inadvertently, played such a
significant role in uncovering it.
I told Tyler, in carefully age-appropriate terms, that his question had actually helped me discover an important misunderstanding between his father and me, one that we'd since worked through together as a family. I emphasized, specifically, how much I appreciated his honesty in simply mentioning what he'd overheard, without either exaggerating it or, alternatively, deciding on his own that it wasn't important enough to mention. "Grandpa," he said, with the particular directness children sometimes offer that adults have often trained themselves out of, "I just thought it was weird that Dad
Kept saying your name on the phone like that. I'm glad it helped, even though I didn't really understand what it meant at the time. I want to tell you about where things stand now, about 8 months after that original Saturday afternoon conversation. Curtis's real estate license review concluded favorably, with only a formal warning rather than any suspension. And his financial situation, while still requiring careful management, and our relationship, while still carrying some residual carefulness on my part regarding financial matters specifically, has genuinely strengthened through the process of working through this difficulty together, rather than simply avoiding or minimizing what had actually happened. Danielle and I speak more openly now, too, having discovered through this entire process that our shared vigilance regarding Curtis's well-being and our shared stake in that original policy gave us a closer working relationship than the simple, occasional holiday phone calls that had characterized much of our adult sibling relationship in the years before this happened. Our Saturday afternoons with Tyler continue, unchanged in their essential warmth, though I find myself, I'll admit, occasionally more attentive now to small comments Tyler makes about conversations he's overheard at home, understanding, since this experience, exactly how valuable a child's unfiltered, honest observation can sometimes prove to be in revealing things adults might otherwise successfully keep hidden. Just last week, we finished an entirely new model airplane kit together, a more advanced design than our first project. And Tyler asked, with the same casual directness that had originally revealed everything to me months earlier, whether Dad's real estate problems were all the way fixed now. I told him honestly that things were considerably better, though managing money wisely is something everyone, including adults, continues working on throughout their entire lives, an answer that seemed to satisfy him completely, before he returned his attention to carefully applying the final coat of dope to our airplane's tissue paper wings, utterly unaware, in the particular way children mercifully are, of how significant his simple questions had actually proven to be for our entire family.
I think about that Saturday afternoon often. Tyler's casual, unprompted question interrupting what would have otherwise been an entirely ordinary day together. I think about how easily that question could have gone unmentioned, how many similarly significant details likely go unnoticed in families every day simply because children don't always recognize the significance of what they've overheard, or because adults don't always think to ask the right follow-up questions when children do mention something potentially important.
I've come to understand my grandson's simple, curious question as a genuine gift, however unintentional, one that allowed me to address a serious situation while there was still time to resolve it constructively, before whatever Curtis might have eventually attempted, had he continued down that particular path unchecked, could have developed into something considerably more difficult to address or repair.
I mentioned this entire experience recently to Roland, the same financial planner who'd helped me establish the original policy 6 years earlier, during a routine annual review of my broader financial affairs. He listened carefully to the full account, and afterward offered a perspective I've found myself returning to often since. "Gordon," he said, "in my experience, the families who navigate financial crises most successfully aren't usually the ones without any conflict or difficult moments at all. They're the ones who catch the warning signs early enough and respond to them directly. Enough that a single concerning incident becomes a turning point toward more honest communication rather than the beginning of a longer, more damaging pattern of secrecy and escalation. I've thought about that distinction often since, understanding that whatever discomfort came from that difficult month of investigation and confrontation, it likely prevented a considerably more serious breach of trust from eventually developing between Curtis and me."
If this story resonated with you, if a child's innocent comment has ever revealed something important that adults around you were trying to keep hidden, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Curtis finally told Tyler the full, honest version of his financial struggles, in terms appropriate for a 12-year-old to understand, that's a story too. Let me know.
One final thought before I close this out. I sometimes wonder what might have happened had Tyler not mentioned that overheard phone call, or had I simply dismissed his comment as ordinary childhood curiosity rather than following up as carefully as I did. Curtis's financial desperation would have continued regardless, quietly building without any of us fully understanding its actual severity. And I genuinely don't know what he might have eventually attempted once the license review's outcome and its accompanying financial pressure reached whatever breaking point he'd apparently
Approaching. I'm deeply grateful, not just for my grandson's simple honesty that particular Saturday afternoon, but for having raised a family, imperfect as we all inevitably are, capable of eventually choosing honest, difficult conversation over continued secrecy once the situation was finally brought fully into the light. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.